of Sri Lanka, Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana, Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Mrs. Yvette Fernando, Secretaries of Ministries, our keynote speaker for today, Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund for India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Bhutan, Dr. Surjit Bala, Assistant Governors of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Heads of Department, our distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this public lecture hosted by the Center for Banking Studies of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Although this much looked forward to event had been taking place throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we are thankful to our keynote speaker and all of you gathered here for joining us physically today after a bit of a hiatus due to COVID-19. Over the last 2 years, policymakers have grappled with striking a balance between the economic toll of COVID-19 and its human toll. It has been a tightrope walk, as we all know. With the discovery of the vaccine, its rollout, and learning to live in the new normal, policymakers are faced with new challenges, addressing the fault lines and fragilities that were already present in the economy. Data from across the globe highlights that women have been among the hardest hit amid this pandemic. A 2020 article by Nicole Bateman and Martha Ross for the Brookings Institution articulates the issue on hand. Problems facing women in the labor market have never been hidden, but they have been inconvenient to address because they are so entrenched in the basic operations of our economy and society. On that note, let me invite Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana, to deliver his opening remarks and, of course, the customary Sri Lankan welcome. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. I would like to make a few comments very briefly to set the stage to Dr. Bala's presentation today. In relation to the standing of women in society and recognition of their contributions, Sri Lanka has always remained somewhat ahead of its peers in the region and globally in relation to the standing of women in society and recognition of their contributions. Although the United States voted first female vice president in 2020, Sri Lanka elected the world's first female prime minister, Mrs. Srimao Bandaranaike, 6 decades before, and in 1960. And in India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was elected as prime minister in 1966. To date, despite cultural and societal norms, women in the South Asia have been breaking the glass ceiling and making a difference across the globe. Even in the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, the gender composition of officers is skewed in favor of women, who account to around 54%. Despite the presence of phenomenal Sri Lankan women on the global stage, such as Shamara Wickramanayake, who is Australia's highest paid CEO, Professor Nilika Malavige, member of the World Health Organization Technical Advisory Committee on COVID-19, and Dr. Asha DeVos, leading marine biologist. Whether such progress is evident at the grassroots level is questionable. Sri Lanka took almost 4 decades to double its female labor force participation rate from about 18% in 1952 to 36% in 1990. Since then, the female labor force participation rate was averaged just 33% and has been on a declining trend in recent years. Although on the whole, Sri Lanka is ahead of South Asian average of 24%, the country's female labor force participation remains much lower than the upper middle income average of 56%. One of the low-hanging solutions to the subdued growth episode that Sri Lanka is experiencing is addressing the issue of getting more women into work through policy agendas that support stronger diversity and inclusion in a gender-sensitive manner. over the long run, women's lack of engagement in the labor force is also a fiscal concern, as it raises concerns regarding the efficacy of expensive education and health investments that are being constantly made amid limited fiscal space. Another global phenomenon is that the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the triple burden on women, causing women to exit the labor force as they left job to take on household chores. For instance, in Sri Lanka, between the first and second quarters of 2021, around 294,000 females have left the labor force, which is a decline of almost 9.5% compared to a decline of just 2.4% among males. These developments reiterate that Sri Lanka is striving to reset the economy and progress onto a higher growth trajectory towards an upper middle income status. Tapping into the potential of women has never been more urgent and important as it is today. So Dr. Surjit Balla's vast research experience spans across the areas of poverty, inequality, gender issues, labor markets, specifically female labor force participation, education, financial sector issues, and inflation targeting, among others. Importantly, Dr. Balla has extensively researched Sri Lanka's growth experience, income distribution, and issues related to living standards. Hence, his lecture will comprise reflections not only stemming from his illustrious career as an academic, researcher, and a policymaker, but also from his long-standing research interest in Sri Lanka. With that, I will now hand over the floor to Ms. Pongu to give an introduction about Dr. Balla. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for setting the tone to today's discussion. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Surjit Balla. Dr. Surjit Balla is Executive Director for India, Sri Lanka, is the IMF's Executive Director for India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. And prior to this appointment, he served as member of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Economic Advisory Council, as chairperson for the Ministry of Commerce High-Level Advisory Group on Trade, and as economic advisor to the 15th Finance Commission of the Government of India. In addition, he is a regular invitee to the Aspen Institute program on world economy, and Dr. Surjit has also taught at the Delhi School of Economics and served as executive director of the policy group in New Delhi, the country's first non-government funded think tank. Since 1999, he has also been on the governing board of India's largest think tank, NCAER. Among other several prestigious positions that he has held throughout his career, he has also been a contributing editor for the Indian Express and has worked as a research economist at the Rand Corporation, the Brookings Institution, and at the World Bank. He has also worked on Wall Street in the Deutsche Bank and Goldman Sachs. He is author of several academic articles as well as 4 books on globalization and its effects on the world economy. Dr. Surjit is also a regular contributor to Indian newspapers, magazines, and television on financial markets, economics, politics, and cricket. He holds a PhD in economics from Princeton University, a master's in public and international affairs from Woodrow Wilson School of the Princeton University, and a BSEE degree from Purdue University. So with that introduction, let me not eat into any of Dr. Surjit's time further, and let me invite him to deliver the keynote speech on the topic, Understanding Women's Work Today, Definitions, Methods, and Policies. Over to you, sir.
It's always a pleasure coming back to Sri Lanka. My first visit was in 1982, and most recently I was here in 2016 on vacation. So thank you, Central Bank, for inviting me for this lecture. And on a topic that I've been working on, it emerged as a joint research project with my wife, who's a sociologist, on female labor force participation and value of girls. So it has taken me some time to finish. She constantly tells me that I'm way behind schedule, but that's why I grabbed this opportunity. Once you have to give a lecture or talk, you can then proceed to formalize it. So think of this as a work in progress, but I will try and keep away from numbers as much as possible, but there will be obviously lots of numbers. And the final draft of this I will have in the form of a complete academic paper. So let me start. Basically, as the title, let me just go to the next slide. And there are three possible titles for this talk. And I think it's broadly in the order that the three titles suggest. There's the issue of definition, there's a question of measurement, there is the conclusion of methods, and then once we go through all of that, I think one of the basic conclusions is that the female labor force participation rate has been misunderstood across the world, and especially with regard to developing countries. There's a recent study by the McKinsey Group which comes to the conclusion that if only women were to work, that GDP would go up by about 20% or so. And also echoed by the IMF, where I now work, etc. And I will try and show that that conclusion may be slightly far-fetched and is in error. And the last part is really what my talk is about, that you know, the world, and especially the developing countries, are going through a change unlike any change the world has experienced. And this change has radical consequences. And that's the future part. And part of the radical consequence is already present. So with that broad introduction, let me proceed. So, you know, the first thing we have to worry about, how should work be defined? Are you working if you work for pay? But what about you're working on the farm? As you know, many developing countries, agriculture, all developing countries, agriculture has been the basic form of work. And in India, 40% of the labor force today is in agriculture. You'll see numbers cited that 60%, 70%. That's an error. That's a political conclusion. It's actually 40%. 40% is very large. It's not a small number. And it's the sector with the highest number of people employed. So agriculture is not like going to office. And work there is not like going to office. So you have to worry about, and a lot of the farm labor, especially female farm labor, is unpaid. Why that is the case, I will discuss later. Then there is the issue of whether the work is for production, which is what the ILO defines as, and I think correctly defined broadly as work. But what about if you work for consumption, and consumption of household goods and household services in particular, one big household service that has emerged, and which for societal reasons is primarily in the domain of the woman, is child and elderly care. There's no logical reason why that should be the case, but we need to recognize that that is the case in most societies, that the women care, or the women are sort of overburdened with a large amount of child care and a large amount of care for the elderly. You know, when this research process started, let's take the 60s or the 70s, the world was very different then, and we weren't living so long, and elderly care was not an issue in the definition of work. But now, and obviously a large part or substantial part or significant part of elderly care in advanced societies is paid through the market, so therefore you can actually price it. But what happens when it is not through the market? Then it doesn't get defined as work. And I'm not even getting to cooking, which for again societal reasons has been dominantly in the care of women. There's no reason for that to be the case, but that is the case. So therefore, should the actual, it takes time to cook, as I've found out, and I don't do much in terms of cooking, but it takes time, and time is of the essence, as they say, and the women are overburdened with time, non-market related time, work that is absolutely necessary for survival, for happiness, for pleasure, etc. Good food probably takes a bit longer to cook than bad. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we have to be very, very careful about what we define as work before coming to the McKinsey IMF conclusion that if women were to work, GDP would be 20% higher. And I'll try and illustrate that with some of the data. So, so now that we have agreed on definition, right, and you can choose whichever definition you want, what should we consider? Are you in the labor force if you're working full-time, or are you in the labor force if you're actually working part-time? Now, India has been a pioneer, actually, in the development of ideas of work as well as defining work for a developing economy. And it has 5 different definitions of whether you are in the labor force or not. There is the principal status, so you work more than 180 days in a year. There's secondary status. Okay, you don't work more than 180 days, but you at least work 30 days in one job. So that's your secondary status. The usual status, which is the most commonly used, combines these two. So that is the third definition. The weekly status is, did you work at least 1 hour a day last week? And that is the most common definition. That's the definition in the rest of the world, or advanced countries, etc. And that's where I think we'll all be gravitating towards, but we're not there yet. And therefore conclusions based on that will be somewhat erroneous. And in India, we even have collected data, though I think now they have stopped it. Actually, not yet, but they might. There's just too much information being gathered through this, it's not clear how much extra usage or extra value it has, is the daily status. Did you work yesterday? Each day of 7 days, all of that data is collected. All of that is available for all you researchers over here on unit level, etc., from 1983 to 2019-20. We've collected all that information, and I'm trying to process it and, if you will, distill it for this paper. But the point is, you have to be very, very careful of what you define as work and how do you measure it. Then there is the issue of what age. You might have seen most labor force studies, even today, have labor forces defined as those above 15 years of age. Thank God this start at 15 and not at 10. And you know, for a very long time in India, the debate was child labor and whether that was happening, etc. And so the reason 15 is now very, very questionable is education. What we've not realized is that the most fundamental change that has occurred is that in terms of education. People are now getting educated a lot more, and it is important to take into account that they are also going to school, and school has zero value in labor force participation. So if you go to school, you're not working, you can't do two things at one time, and then you're defined as not in the labor force. Now, all of this would not have mattered if it were not the case of the misunderstanding or the misuse of, and I will show how this data has been misused or misinterpreted. So, and that's this. Confusion matters. And the reason the confusion matters is that policies are based on it, and politics is very much involved in terms of assessing female labor force participation rates. Notice I've not mentioned male labor force participation rate, okay? Because that is not issue, that is not controversial. It's relatively straightforward, even though there has been a decline, as you mentioned, even in Sri Lanka, etc. There's been a decline over time of male participation rates, but that decline has been minor. For females, here's a study that what led to the plethora of studies about female labor force participation rate in India. And what you had was that prior to 2004, you know, the Sri Lankan labor force participation rate, female, has been relatively constant for a long time. So give or take 33, 35, 36, 37%. And Indian labor force participation, so think of whenever I'm talking labor force participation, it's actually female labor force. But Indian labor force participation rates was already hovered around that time, that number. And the last such number that was observed was in 2004-05, when the participation rate was 42% by the usual status. It was, principal status was 38% or whatever. So it was high, it was okay, and not a story. The 2011-12 data comes out, which came out in 2013 or so, and it showed a radical decline. Now the participation rate dropped by 12 percentage points. It's never before dropped. It was always hovering around, and if you will, had a slight tendency to increase, because that's what all the studies, Western studies, etc., show, that with development, there's a U-shaped curve. There's a U-shaped in no matter what you want to study. If it's income inequality, there's a U-shape. There's an inverted U, if they say income. So early stages, very, very early stages, everybody has to work to survive. Though I don't know what data they have or which definition, but basically you start off at very, very high levels of labor force participation. Then with income growth, etc., it's supposed to magically decline, and it declines. And then with more education, it starts to rise again. So that's what the empirical data shows, and quite regular and rigorous. And again, if one were to put it through the magnifying glass, it's not clear that you would observe the same pattern. It has to do a lot with definitions and what is defined as work and not, rather than your income goes up, now you've household income has gone up, so therefore women don't need to go out and work. That has been a popular explanation, and therefore they're staying at home because they're satisfied with. Now, why at a particular level they're satisfied with income and not beyond that particular level is a question not answered. It's just an empirical regularity, like the Kuznets curve on income inequality, and just like the Kuznets curve, just as wrong. Income inequality in the world today is at the lowest levels since 1870. There has been a steady, this is world, in each country goes through its pattern. But the point I want to illustrate is that some of the stylized facts are stylized because precisely there's style to them, but may not be that much empirical regularity or empirical truth behind them. But anyway, coming back to female labor force participation rate. So this observation came out in 2013, and there were hardly any articles. There were some people, one study, ILO study, which noted it, and as to why that had, and correctly concluded that it may have something to do with who was defined as working and who was not. But basically it wasn't, not much attention was paid. And this is where the story gets interesting. And not much attention was paid until, I think, and the coincidence is there, and you can interpret, the Modi government came to power in 2014. And you're a democracy, India's democracy. There are at least two parties competing for the throne, and the party that is out of power wants to get back into power. Very natural. And then we'll do whatever it takes within limits to get to power. So one of the weapons that the opposition used was that something was drastically wrong with the Indian economy. And what was drastically wrong with the Indian economy? Well, the labor force participation rate had declined. Never mind that the labor force participation rate declined as of 2011. Never mind that it was not so accurate, but it was then inferred that it has something to do with the political administration. So there were studies, as I mentioned here, a deluge of studies saying that something was wrong in the Indian economy. There was a famous World Bank study, precipitous drop in female employment in India. Then there was a special study at the IMF and several other studies coming to the same conclusion. And that's what I will, so there's definition, there's how you measure it, and then there's politics. So you have to be a bit careful on all of them. So when you start looking at the data a little bit more detail, and some authors have begun to point this out, that what you observe is that the decline in labor force participation was primarily, exclusively in rural areas. It was not in, and the category with the most decline was unpaid family labor. So labor that tended for animal husbandry, labor that tended for getting water from outside, etc., used to be classified as work in the 2004 survey and everything before, and now was not classified as work. So that basically accounts for almost the entire difference. And the same surveys, when we were concluding that something was wrong with the economy, was that paid jobs actually increased. Urban jobs actually increased, or the female labor force participation in urban areas actually went up. And educated jobs, that was those with higher education, increased. So it really didn't paint the same picture of or a decline in employment or of work, of something being wrong. But the conclusions were just the opposite. The expert conclusions were that India needed 10 million jobs a year and was only providing 4 million. And that is another paper, I won't go into it now, but that's possibly another paper as to how wrong that conclusion was. But it is all tied to politics, and it's all tied to understanding labor force participation. There's a major private sector organization, the one that provides all the stock market data, etc., and a very, very good one. So they decided to go into these surveys, and 2018-19 concluded that female labor force participation rate in India was down to 10%, which is not only the lowest in the world ever observed, but lower than Yemen and every other country. Saudi Arabia, incidentally, today, the labor force participation rate is in the high 20s, if not the early 30s. So almost the same as Sri Lanka, and I will discuss as to why that is the case and what is happening there. But, you know, can you imagine a conclusion like, you know, 10% female labor force participation rate, when the actual measured ones by the officially, and in my view officially mismeasured, hence this discussion and hence this paper, was 25%. So here these guys, and they're given, it's everybody's right to publish whatever, but when it's given credence is when you begin to think that this is more politics than economics or more facts. So, and you know, and India was right in the midst of an election campaign, now the second one in 2019, the second election, and you know, the conclusion was something was wrong with the Indian economy, something was wrong with the management of the Indian economy. What was wrong is the female labor force participation rate was the lowest in the world, and therefore everything was wrong. So basically, just to point out that politics is not, you know, no matter where you go in the world today, politics is a major, you know, aspect of life, of policy, and we all have to be cognizant of that. Now, one other very strong fundamental change that has happened over the last 30, 40 years is the spread of education. And that has consequences. And that has consequences in discussions, and has consequences for productivity, has consequences for male-female relations, has consequences for measurement. For example, I'll give you some startling facts about, these are not unknown or unfamiliar to a Sri Lankan audience, but for an Indian audience, this is radical change. Today, and the first time I came to Sri Lanka was in 1982, when I did a study on entitled "Is Sri Lanka an Exception?" because it had very high education levels. It had very high or very good health indicators, and it was considered that this was directly a consequence of policy, of funding for these aspects. And that may not have been the case, but nevertheless, so for Sri Lanka, education parity and educational enrollment and achievement for women and men has been broadly equal for a long, long time. Not so in India. Now, across the board, primary, secondary, tertiary, there is equal percentages of women and men in college. And indeed, in college, there are more women than men. A greater percentage of women go to college than men. And notice Oxford University in 2018 very importantly broadcast that they now had more women undergraduates than men. In the first time in 1,000-year existence of Oxford University. So that's just to illustrate that what has taken developing countries 30, 40 years, for advanced countries has taken a long, long time. And that's really the force of radical change, not just in India, all developing countries. And that is not understood or appreciated by either researchers or even policymakers or even people at large, that we are in the midst of a mega revolution of change. And a very important part of that is the fact that education is now equal and equally accessible. And that's, I had mentioned Saudi Arabia before. I did a study on Saudi Arabia in 2014, and I love forecasting, whether it's cricket matches or politics or female labor force participation, but I said that, what's an educated woman to do? They have income, but they feel bored. They should feel bored. And that very soon they would demand change because they're now educated. When you are uneducated or less educated, you can't stand on your own 2 feet. But when you're educated, you're independent. That has profound social and cultural consequences. And that is what has happened in Saudi Arabia in spades in just a matter of 5 years. They've gone from a labor force participation rate of something like 12% to now 27 or 30+%. Okay. Then there is, let me get a little bit of water. Here we are. Then the other concern, political concern and otherwise, is that there's no gender equality in wages, and that something is wrong in the marketplace. There's discrimination, and there's measurement of how much discrimination there is, and therefore government has to institute special policies. This is in the Western world as well as the rest of the world. in order to have equal pay for equal work. It's one of the biggest slogans around, equal pay for equal work, thereby really stating that there isn't, that women do the same work and get less pay. So I'm going to examine how far that is true. Okay. So June O'Neill, in a paper in early 2000 in a prestigious economics journal, the American Economic Review, reviewed the subject then for US data as to what extent were women getting less pay for equal work. And the raw data, so you look at average earnings per woman and average earnings per man, and the average earnings per woman was 25% below average earnings per man, worker. That's a big gap. And in a marketplace where things are, and Gary Becker obviously had written about this in the Economics of Discrimination, like he had written on human capital, and most of the profound changes, the guru of most of those, or the guru in terms of thinking, and most of the ideas that have developed was Gary Becker. And and he had said that, look, if I discriminate, I don't hire a black, or I don't hire a woman because of their ability, I will lose profits, because somebody else can hire them and pay less than whatever a male got or a white man got, and get higher profits. And soon, if everybody did that, what you'll find is that profits will disappear, and women or blacks or whatever will get the same wage as men. So this is a big, big study. I don't want to go into big studies on black-white earnings and gender pay discrimination. I just want to highlight this study, which showed that as of June 2000, as of 2000 US, the raw data said that there was 25% lower wages for women, but once you adjusted for three factors, occupation, education, and experience, you found that gap got substantially reduced to less than 10%. I think our estimate was 9% at that time. And the reason why is because experience, as you know, is a major part of a human capital model, and the reason was that women bear kids, biological, and when you are carrying a baby, then it turns out that it's not that easy to work. These days, of course, with Zoom and everything else, for some jobs, women are equally capable of doing, quote unquote, the market work. But for large majority of work, you're not as productive when you're pregnant as not, and therefore you go out of the labor force. And when you come back into the labor force, you have less experience, and experience matters. So, but all of that accounted for about 10% of the earnings of the man, less earnings. What is the story in India? Developing country, just like yours, lower middle income country. And what one observes with the most recent data on India is that wages for women and men for salaried jobs, and I'll explain why I'm taking salaried jobs and why I'm taking the age limit 15 to 34, wages are now equal. There isn't, so the raw number in India is still 25%, just the same as the rest of the world. That's another stylized fact. Women on average earn 25% less than men. In India, if you look at salaried jobs of women, of females in the age 15 to 34, there is parity. So what's going on? And why am I stopping at 34? Because I want to prove a point? Yes. But what's the reason? Why is 34 the magic number? Because if you do for the entire 35 to 64, women have, on average, those 35 years and above, 2.5 years less education than men. That's just because to do with societal biases? Absolutely. Women were not encouraged to have education? Absolutely. But it is the case that, and study after study after study has shown, that education has about, on average, a 10% rate of return. So if you adjust the earnings of women for their education, just like June O'Neill and other scholars have done for the US, etc., there is wage parity across the board, which is not observed that much in the West. There's still a 10% gap. Here there's zero gap. And I think this is a trend for the future, for the rest of the world. I haven't, if I can get the household data for, and wage data, I'd love to do this test and or analysis for Sri Lanka as well. But this is based on unit level data in India, labor force data, the very same data that was criticized for political reasons, because it showed things were slightly better than what the political opposition wanted to believe. But nevertheless, the story is there is parity in wages in India because there's parity in education. Nothing else, okay? And it is quite a surprise, and therefore, and the rest of the people are explained by them having less education. Another factor, again, evidence from India as to how things are radically different. It so happens that India has the 4th highest number of women in STEM disciplines, 42% in the world. And I think there are three countries ahead. I think 2 of them are in Eastern Europe or whatever. But India is the only major country with that high a STEM ratio of 42%. That is, 42% of all graduates of women are in STEM disciplines. There's no longer they're doing English or whatever. This is STEM. Almost half graduate in STEM disciplines. And in the US and Western Europe, that number is somewhere around 30%, maybe in some instances 35%. So again, to point out that there's something maybe different about female labor force participation rates in India and the male-female economy in India than in the Western world. Then there is, I'm sure this is a constant topic. I know it's a big topic at the fund, at all the international institutions, etc., and they're all busy trying to make sure that for every job there are equal number of women and men. Now let's sit back, okay? And is that fair? Is that correct? That they should be equal? We know, and for various societal and other reasons, biological, some of them has to do with fertility, that the women in the labor force are somewhere around 50%. In India it's lower, some places higher, etc. But the world average is somewhere around 50%. In the advanced countries, it's maybe 55, 60%. Okay? Men are, for whatever reasons, non-economic, social reasons, they are the major breadwinners, were or are, but may not be for long, and that I'll conclude with that somewhere later. They are about 90%. So therefore, there are 140 workers, and 50 of them are women. So 50 out of 140 is approximately 35%, or whatever the exact number comes out. So to achieve parity in jobs, parity in senior jobs, parity in whatever you want to take, it's not the case that there should be equal number of men and women at all levels, senior levels, junior levels, whatever calculation. They now have equal education, despite they have equal ability. I will argue that for various reasons, women have higher ability, but that I'll conclude with that in a minute. But, you know, to go ahead and say we shall achieve parity in education, in jobs between men and women is just empirically, logically, conceptually flawed, unless you solve the problem of fertility, of men bearing kids. And maybe the next generation might see that happening. But until that time, you know, or there's no zero level of fertility. Indeed, that's a greater danger facing the world today than anything else. So those are social problems. They're not economic problems. Those are social considerations that we all have to worry about. So basically, 35% is a new equality. It's not 50-50. And there is, so if you look at, take that metric, and I'm doing some, the revised version of the paper will show you, after adjusting for labor force, how many managers, how many professionals in each country. This is ILO data, and it has the labor force participation rate data. And I'll find out how many countries are below the new normal, or below, are actually where the glass ceiling exists. And you know, it was mentioned about political. This is not this is marketplace. That in terms of politics, there isn't that much of a glass ceiling. Certainly not in this part of the world. Okay, now I'm going to end shortly, but really the unpaid family work, go back to the beginning and to understand for the first time, as T.S. Eliot would say. You have the unpaid family work is steadily declining over time as everything is becoming marketized. And the reason it's declining is education again. If you have equality of education, then there's very little of unpaid. Everything is priced in the market. Then there's the other, again, got to do with the social changes. The tiger mom syndrome. Notice, nobody's ever written an article about tiger fathers. Why? It turns out, and I'm just saying from experience, but I'm sure there are studies, etc. Women take care, and actually time use studies show that women spend about 2 hours more on childcare than men do. This is as recently as 2019 across the world. Women spend more time teaching their children, helping them with their homework than men do. That's the tiger mom syndrome. Now, they don't have to do it, the fathers should do it, etc. I'm not going into the area why fathers are doing or not doing it. I'm just pointing out that the women are actually going back to the McKinsey conclusion that you just, or the World IMF conclusion, you just raise women's labor force participation rate and beholden, Eureka, there will be increased output, 20% increased output, increased GDP. That is just plain wrong. And there is a lot of, the social change, the revolution change, that women were gathering wood before, gathering water before, and now they are the tiger moms of the present and perhaps also of the future. That's what work is, and that's what female labor force participation is. Now, get to conclusion. I guess it's time. So, one consequence of education, equality in education, and this I mentioned with regard to Saudi Arabia in particular, because there the change has been so rapid and so stark and so large. There is a parallel revolution to the education revolution, and caused, in my view, by education, is a great fertility decline. India just reported for 2019 that the fertility rate in India was below replacement level at 2. Sri Lanka has had it for a long time. But for a major economy, major developing economy, and major formerly poor economy, to achieve a fertility level of 2 is absolutely incredible. But it points to the change that is happening. So women are having less kids. The reason they're having less kids is that they're more educated. So let's take it that they're more educated now than they ever have been, and equally educated to the men. What happens? Why should a woman stay at home taking care of the kids or whatever? And even if you can hire, let's say you're rich and you can hire nannies to take care of the kids, then what's she going to do at home? Why would she be at home? There's no, we all derive pleasure from work. And therefore, why shouldn't they derive from careers, from aspirations, etc.? So why is it that only the men should have that luxury and not the women? And that's what, and especially now that they're having more education than men. And I think what I think the new item we have to deal with, and now I will conclude, which is in the future of work section, and really what we, I think the world, where is that sheet of fine? I had a nice line, yes. So this is what, I'll just take a few minutes, but I think this is, I had mentioned how I like making forecasts. So this is now a forecast about society. I think because of these radical changes, which society has never ever experienced before. It was, the brawn, the hunters, the women staying at home, bearing kids, having 9 kids, then it came down to 7 kids, now it's down to less than 2 kids, etc. A lot of time on their hands, lot of education, perhaps even more education than that of men. This is going to change social relationships. This is going to affect marriages. What happens when a woman earns more than a man? What happens to that marriage? I mean, it's happening. I'm not saying there are dire consequences. We should learn to deal with it, but that is a new problem, quote unquote problem, and problem only from the male side, not necessarily from the female side, that is emerging. So to conclude, there's a revolution going on, and we don't even know it, let alone appreciate it. On that note, I'll end. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Surjit, for that insightful speech on many intricacies of the female labor market, and also found very interesting the several perspectives that you brought together, and also that data often needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. Thank you, sir, for that insightful speech. So now we will open the floor for questions, and there are 2 floating mics. So if anybody has any questions, you can always raise your hand and introduce yourself and pose your questions, please.
Sir, how would you advise Sri Lanka to get out of the current foreign currency crisis?
Sorry,
How
if
would
we take the mask off, I'll be able to understand.
how would you advise Sri Lanka to get out of the current foreign currency crisis that we are facing?
I don't know, I haven't yet related currency crisis to female labor force participation rate, but that is, indeed I've written a book on called Devaluing to Prosperity. And it is a matter of some interest, but that's also a separate talk and a separate discussion.
So you've written an article in the Financial Express that I was just reading,
Yeah.
where you suggest that India would be better off borrowing in foreign currency, and you
Yeah.
seem to attack Raghuram Rajan and some.
You know, let me look. It turns out, and the article is, and this is something that I proposed at the fund, and etc., and was preceded by an earlier article in which I observed that the premium that many countries, so 90% of the countries, developing countries, they pay for market borrowings, commercial borrowings, international borrowings, is about 3 to 4 percentage points higher than other countries. So for example, the 10-year bond yield right now in the US is 1.5%. And if India was to go and borrow, it won't be able to get less than, it'll have to pay more than 5%, or 4.5 to 5%. And then obviously that's graded by different countries' ability to pay. But for India has $800 billion worth of, or 670 or something billion dollars of reserves, and we are not in a unstable situation. So why should we have to pay? And my conclusion is that, and historically, that premium is too high, and it is in that context I'd argued. But it's very much dependent on what the nature of the economy is, the nature of reserves is, etc. But I would still maintain it has very little to do with female labor force participation rate.
Since I'm the master of ceremonies, I'll take the privilege of asking the second question.
Yeah.
Doctor, so in a recent IMF podcast that was done by Geeta Gopinath and Jayati Ghosh, she shares some thoughts on the care economy, the economy that many of us are actually innately part of, but we often don't appreciate or value. So if you have any thoughts on the same.
No, so they had a talk on childcare.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. No, I know that Jayati has been writing, and Geeta also. I mean, look, I don't know what they've said, but I don't think they would have said too much different than what I have. You know, and both are women. So look, I mean, so it is something that we all have to. This is, you know, mega changes. I hope somebody asked them, Geeta, at that conference or presentation about the McKinsey and IMF conclusion that GDP will go up by 20% if women worked. That goes counter to the child care. So no, I think, you know, it is, we have too much of a, not a hang up, but we're too constrained by, we're too much prisoners of old thinking. And, you know, the globalization, and I've written, as you mentioned in the introduction, 4 books on different aspects of globalization. So, I mean, it's, you know, I'm not a societal expert, but whatever little knowledge I have of history and of the world, I mean, the world hasn't gone through what it's gone through in the last 50 years. This will, has had, is having, and will have profound consequences. And is already, like Sweden, for example, gives you equal, there's paternity leave and maternity leave, and they're equal. India instituted this policy, I think 2-3 years ago, where you get, a father gets the same time off from work paid as the mother. So I think this is going to happen more and more. And I think we'll get into the childcare, because, you know, if I were a woman, I love my kids. I have 2 kids. But why should it be a burden of the mother? So I think that those are the issues we need to grapple with.
Thank you, sir. So let me hand over the floor again to our audience to raise any questions. Preferably within the context of this lecture.
The International Finance Corporation states that Sri Lanka has a low amount of women representation among board members, which we have at 9.5, and other countries like India and Bangladesh have higher representation. Any comments as to why this is happening?
So low amount of representation, sorry, I didn't. In the board. Oh, you mean the quotas? The quotas.
Corporate board.
Oh, I see. So give me the board of directors of companies, and just give me the statistic again, that India has what percentage?
Sri Lanka is at 9.5.
9.5.
While we are ranked lower than India and Bangladesh. So as to why that is happening here, and how does India India doing better?
India and Bangladesh have more representation of women in the board of directors of firms than Sri Lanka has. And why is that the case? No, I think I don't see any a priori reason why that should be the case. But again, it varies enormously, like I mentioned on STEM, that advanced countries have lower number of women in STEM disciplines than even India and a lot of the developing countries. So I don't know why that is the case. I like to look at the numbers and then perhaps come to some, you know, it's an interesting statistic, but I'll have to look at it. And I think one should be doing more of these, that if they are comparable economies and they have broadly the same amount of labor force participation, Bangladesh is a bit higher, but the reason labor force participation rates in Bangladesh are higher is that there's more unpaid family labor there. So again, I think it's a nice, valid comparison, and it needs to be assessed. So thanks for pointing that out. I will look at it. It's an interesting statistic or stylized fact.
There isn't a particularly strong feminist movement in South Asia. So I'm trying to understand, like, what it is that you're doing in Sri Lanka to give a lecture saying that that there isn't a need for a sort of gender movement.
Sorry, why am I giving this lecture
Yeah, because there's not a
Oh,
really
there's a
large
yeah.
feminist movement in Sri. There's no one really seriously arguing for the things that you seem to be fighting against, saying that there isn't a gender gap below 35, because no one is really saying that in a strong voice. So my question is basically, what are you doing in Sri Lanka?
Oh, I am executive director at the IMF.
Right.
Okay, and the IMF visits every country in the world to write an economic report, and that is why I'm here.
Can you speak a little to that, because that's what people are interested in hearing.
Well, unfortunately, this is something I had suggested that I'm working on this topic, and I really wanted, but perhaps you can have an organization invite me, and I can talk on that subject. But
Just to add Dr. Bala's the reply on that, in fact, he is the executive director at the IMF to the constitution, which comprises of 4 countries: India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. It is customary that executive director visits to these 4 countries whenever he is able, and luckily he has found time and visited Sri Lanka. So we as the central bank took that opportunity to have a lecture on one of the experts areas of Dr. Bala. So that's what it is now.
Right. In the interest of time, since we've crossed our prescribed time slot, I think we will move on. So all good things must come to an end. And let me take this opportunity to invite Assistant Governor, Mrs. Nelmani Dawlagala, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening. I'm sure all of you found this seminar on understanding women's work today, definition, methods, policies. It was very insightful and thought-provoking. So first of all, let me thank Deputy Governor Mr. Mahinda Siriwardana, who chaired the meeting, and he set the tone for the event by his very interesting opening remarks. Then on behalf of the Center for Banking Studies and Central Bank of Sri Lanka, I wish to extend my sincere gratitude to you, Dr. Surajit Balla, for first of all accepting our invitation and delivering this very insightful lecture today. Your speech actually created much awareness. You spoke of course, female labor force participation, the definitions, the measurements, and also the confusion that goes with it. Then also, you spoke of the impact of education on equal pay, then the impact of politics in policy making in this area, and most importantly, the ongoing revolution and the radical changes and how the policymakers will have to take these into account. So I'm sure all of you would have found this very useful, and it will be of great use for policy making by paving the way to stimulate dialogue and formulating recommendations to tackle every stage of women's economic empowerment. Finally, on behalf of the Central Bank, I thank all the distinguished invitees, officials representing ministries, government, private institutions, agencies, and last but not least, my colleagues at the Central Bank who joined us today at the atrium, as well as those who joined online. Have a pleasant evening and stay safe. Thank you again.
thank you very much.
With that, we reach the conclusion of today's proceedings. Thank you very much, everyone, for your avid enthusiasm and interest in today's discussions. And we look forward to meeting you at similar fora organized by the Center of Banking Studies and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. With that, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite you for refreshments in the adjoining lobby of our staff.